Large frontier labs and American politicians are sat around today wondering how they can combat the rise of Chinese open weight models. There's clearly a lot of worry of the threat that they pose both to the sustainability of model development and how the AI war might develop. Interestingly, the proposals are quite extreme and I want to run through them. Let's just begin, shall we? This all began when Kimi K3, a open-weight Chinese model by Moonshot AI, released on Thursday. And essentially, as you can see from this picture here, is able to match, if not beat, some of the most frontier models available today. It's as good as ChatGPT 5.6 Sol, Fable 5, and when it's not as good as them, it is as good, if not better, than Opus 4.8 in some of the benchmark tests. This is important because remember, those models, well, for instance, Fable 5 and ChatGPT 5.6 Sol, only released in the last month. So these are new models. Most people online expected that these models wouldn't be beat by China for at least 6 to 12 months. Yet, here we are in July, and they're already there. It's a big deal because Moonshot AI does not have the funding, the tens of billions of dollars in funding that the likes of Anthropic and OpenAI have in order to generate and produce the frontier models that they have. Of course, they're able to do it because they distill American models. And Kimi K3 was so popular that within only a couple of days, they had to essentially stop allowing people to buy subscriptions for their model because they didn't have the capacity or the hardware infrastructure available to serve the demand that this model was generating. And that's how competitive this model had become. They even say here, over the past 48 hours, demand has pushed close to the limit of our current capacity. To protect the experience of existing subscribers, we're temporarily pausing new subscription and prioritizing compute for current members. The interesting thing about Kimi K3 is that even though they've said the demand is enormous, Databricks, a massive S&P 500 company, is saying the same thing. If we just look at this article here, it says it itself. Databricks CEO, we host most open source models such as Kimi and offer them to our customers. Demand has been so strong that we are now running out of GPUs across multiple regions. We nearly exhausted our GPU capacity in Asia and demand is rising in countries including Japan, South Korea and the United States and India. And only a day or two after Kimi was released, actually Alibaba's Qwen 3.8 was announced, and it's also similarly a 2.4 trillion parameter model. Which will also be an open weight model which will become available in the near future. This all seems a bit of a coincidence. Why are these Chinese labs all of a sudden willing to publish these open weight models? Essentially, it should not be a coincidence that this is all happening at once. And that Wall Street Journal even goes on to say that if the Shanghai event was uncomfortable because it was hot, that for the public who lined up by the tens of thousands to get in, it was just so much so for American companies competing with Chinese AI technology. On the first day, Beijing-based Moonshot AI jolted global markets with a new model seen as ranking with the world's best. It took just 2 days for another Chinese model, Alibaba, to claim to have topped Moonshot with its own new model. Some 20 football fields of exhibition space were filled with hardware trying to apply AI to everyday life, such as earbuds that listen to a meeting and produce a transcript. Robots were everywhere, dancing in unison, making cappuccinos, shooting soccer goals, massaging visitors and playing the piano. This was the 9th year for the annual World Artificial Intelligence Conference in Shanghai, and it has emerged as a premier occasion for China to strut its stuff in AI. Beijing flaunted its prowess at overcoming US sanctions that largely block Chinese companies access to the best AI chips and chip making equipment. It's fun to be at the frontier of the whole thing, said an Alibaba business development manager at the company's booth. So China want to be ahead of this space, as we already know. So how is America, the frontier labs and its politicians responding to this, you might be wondering? Well, this article does a good job at explaining it. Top American AI execs sound alarm on Chinese models. White House is divided on how to respond to recent advances in Chinese AI and has weighed crackdown measures. OpenAI and Anthropic executives are sounding the alarm about the rise of cheap AI, particularly powerful new models produced in China, suggesting they will lead to a dystopian AI future and present unacceptable security risks without regulation. Evidently, they're thinking about potentially banning, if not prohibiting, open weight Chinese models as best as they can. And there's two rationales for this. First of all, cheaper models from China that have been distilled or basically trained on the frontier models from America, American companies and American investors mostly, have paid to create that product, and China basically copied it, but they always do, is bad. Simply because if China are able to learn off of those models at a smaller cost and therefore price their models, which have been taught off of those more frontier models, and then price them at a lower cost, it essentially removes and destroys the operating profitability margins of the frontier models. Apparently, according to rumors, OpenAI runs at about a 33% operating margin. So that can be quickly eroded if China are undercutting them, essentially or effectively dumping their models onto the world. They've done it in the past. It wouldn't be a surprise if that's their plan in the future. It could absolutely upend America's progress in this department. It also does another thing, which is that if they undercut the American models and fight on price, they could very well easily become the leading AI model across the globe, or at least significant parts of the globe, which would be alarming because AI is the future. In this same article, Dean Bull, who used to work for OpenAI and the Trump administration, says something interesting. He said, one probable outcome of an open weight model dominant world is full AI communism, which is precisely what China proposes. Rather than a market product, AI is a public good which will ultimately be provided by the state as a kind of digital public infrastructure, Dean Bull, OpenAI head of strategic futures, said in the next post on Friday. Bull, a former Trump administration official, called such a scenario a dystopian hellscape, and he expected the Trump administration to make moves towards reducing the use of open source models. Bull later clarified that he wasn't advocating for US governments to discourage Chinese AI. I think that's an interesting point of view because ultimately these models are going to get so powerful, I'd be surprised if governments like, for instance, the United Kingdom, who don't have their own bespoke model, wouldn't want to have a model that they can control. After all, if all the means of productions are going through the AI models themselves, wouldn't local governments and countries want to own their own model? David Sachs goes on to say something interesting too. David Sachs, a venture capitalist and White House AI advisor, suggested that he read Bull's post as a confession to a regulatory capture strategy. Sachs and others have long seen calls for AI regulation by companies such as Anthropic as efforts to use new laws and policies to limit competitors. The weaponization of regulatory uncertainty as a competitive tool should be completely unacceptable. Now, the anti-regulation argument is a simple one. It's just basically trying to stifle competition and allow the incumbents who have already built sophisticated models to get ahead without finding themselves in positions of competition, which is always beneficial. Actually, if you look across the world, regulation is usually there in order to help the incumbent market prevent themselves being competed by savvier, more nimble, smaller companies. In economics, the one way to prevent monopolies or oligopolies is in order to have low barriers to entry. And one of the highest barriers to entry is usually compliance and regulation. These developments are worrying the US government. Remember, Axios only recently just reported the Trump administration is fighting a battle against the Chinese AI. The Trump administration is showing signs it could ban cutting-edge Chinese AI models, a momentous move that could lock in dominance by OpenAI and Anthropic. Jim Cramer himself has said, we must not let our companies use these Chinese models to save a few bucks. OpenAI and Anthropic are correct. This is vital national security. Please read Big West's just released Cat 5. I respect the Chinese people greatly, but these companies are run by the PLA, for heaven's sake. So there's a lot of conflicting arguments here. I'm not a big fan of the way China are operating here. I think their whole strategy is to upend and reduce the incentive of deploying and investing in new frontier models. They're clearly worried about the dominance America has in this space, and I think they want to undercut largely. And the fact is that they've found a method to do that quite efficiently. Funny enough, the stock market actually responded negatively when Kimi came out because there was efficiencies to be gained in the way that they created their model. But it turned out in the end that was for no reason because there was an enormous amount of demand for the model and it wasn't as efficient for memory's sake as they were letting on.